At the height of Japan's rapid advance in early 1942, the Pacific Ocean became an open graveyard for Allied aircraft. Few people today realize just how many airmen disappeared without a trace during those first chaotic months. The war was still young, morale was fragile, and whole units were being pushed to their limits in a theater where the distances were unforgiving and the environment offered no second chances. Among the earliest of these vanishings was the case of Ensign Harold Dixon of Fighter Squadron 6, VF-6, operating from the USS Enterprise during the desperate struggle to contain Japanese power around Rabaul. His disappearance marked the beginning of a disturbing pattern that would haunt Allied aviators for the rest of the war. Dixon's squadron had been flying long-range patrols to monitor Japanese ship movements near New Britain. The Enterprise Air Group was under immense pressure. Rabaul's airfields had become a fortress hosting some of Japan's most experienced Zero pilots. Every flight risked an encounter with an enemy who controlled the skies with precision and aggression. Dixon, only 22 years old, had already completed several missions over hostile waters. His wingman later described the stress of those sorties in a brief note. "You flew with your teeth clenched the entire time. The ocean felt endless and Rabaul felt like a steel trap waiting to close." That tension set the stage for the strange disappearance that followed. On February 15, 1942, a four-plane patrol launched shortly after dawn. The weather was clear, the seas calm, conditions favorable for reconnaissance. For nearly an hour, the patrol maintained routine radio chatter, reporting scattered enemy vessels and cloud patches forming to the south. Then, suddenly Dixon's voice cut through the radio waves. "Engine running rough, may need to break off." His tone was controlled but strained. A few seconds later he added, "Dropping altitude. Attempting to stabilize." Those were the last words anyone heard from him. Patrol leader Lieutenant John Meyer circled back, searching for the distinctive silver-blue silhouette of Dixon's F-4F Wildcat. At first, Meyer suspected a mechanical failure. Wildcats were rugged but prone to carburetor and fuel pump issues, especially after long hours in the humid Pacific air. But what made the situation unnerving was Dixon's sudden disappearance from view. The patrol had been flying in loose formation, able to see each other across wide arcs of ocean. Yet within moments, Dixon seemed to have vanished into the glare below. A formal search began by midday. The Enterprise launched additional scouts, sweeping vast grids between Cape St. George and the Street Matthias Islands. Search planes reported patches of debris, small, indistinct fragments, but nothing conclusive. No oil slick. No fuselage. No life raft. The Wildcat's emergency dye markers, which would have stained the water bright green, were never spotted. As the hours passed, the squadron's logbook filled with terse entries. One pilot wrote, "Impossible to judge where he ditched. Waters calm. Visibility good. Should have been easy to sight if afloat." The calm conditions that morning make the disappearance even more puzzling. Had Dixon ditched successfully but drifted out of the search zone? Had he been intercepted by a Zero flight that never appeared on Allied radar? Or had mechanical failure sent his aircraft into a steep, unrecoverable descent faster than his patrol realized? Years later, naval historians would revisit Dixon's case and point to the complexity of early war navigation. Without reliable long-range radio direction finding and with maps often inaccurate by miles, a pilot losing altitude could be far from where his squadron estimated. Others suggest the possibility of sudden engine seizure. Wildcat failures sometimes caused catastrophic nosedives that left little floating wreckage. Still, none of these explanations fully clarify why no trace of pilot or plane was ever recovered. One poignant detail remains in VF-SAX's squadron notes. Dixon had written a brief letter the night before his final flight. In it, he told his sister, "The ocean is bigger than anything I imagined. Some days you feel like a speck moving across God's own desert." His words captured the vulnerability felt by many aviators at the time, young men facing an expanse where a single failure could erase them completely. Modern analysts reviewing the case often highlight the early Pacific War's rudimentary search and rescue capabilities. Without satellite tracking, GPS, or long-endurance helicopters, the ocean itself dictated the limits of what could be found. Even so, Dixon's disappearance stands out. No enemy claims, no confirmed impact point, no drifting wreckage. Only silence. As dusk settled on February 15th, the Enterprise recalled its search planes. The sea had swallowed whatever clues remained. Dixon was listed as missing, presumed lost, one of the earliest pilots to vanish during the long fight for the Solomons and New Guinea. But his case would not be the last. In the months ahead, the skies around the Pacific would claim more airmen, sometimes in combat, sometimes under circumstances even stranger than Dixon's final transmission. And soon, the pattern would deepen as two more Allied pilots disappeared during a bombing run over Bougainville, leaving their fellow airmen with even more unanswered questions. By mid-1943, Allied air power in the South Pacific had sharpened into a relentless offensive machine, but the skies over Bougainville remained some of the most hazardous anywhere in the world. What many don't realize is that the dense weather systems around the island could swallow an aircraft just as effectively as enemy fire. Pilots often reported walls of cloud, rising tens of thousands of feet, impenetrable formations that forced split-second decisions. It was into this unforgiving environment that Lieutenants Charles Kingsley and Robert Hale of the U.S. Army Air Forces vanished during a bombing mission that still confounds historians. The two men served with the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron, flying B-25 Mitchell bombers from airstrips carved out of the jungle at Guadalcanal. By early May 1943, Allied intelligence believed that Bougainville's coast shelters, supply dumps, and small craft staging areas were preparing to reinforce Japanese positions farther south. The 17th was ordered to disrupt this buildup. Kingsley commanded a veteran crew. Hale, flying as his formation wingman, had earned respect for his calm demeanor during flak-heavy missions. Their B-25s had survived dogfights, engine failures, and long over-water flights where fuel calculations could mean life or death. The squadron launched shortly after sunrise on May 9th. The mission profile was typical. A fast, low-altitude sweep along Bougainville's western coastline, bombing supply huts and strafing barges before climbing out toward open water. Weather reports were marginal, broken cloud layers, scattered storms forming near Empress Augusta Bay, but nothing severe enough to cancel the run. Bougainville's weather was like a living thing, one pilot later wrote. It could turn on you in seconds. Still, the crews pressed on. As the formation approached the island, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from concealed jungle positions. Witnesses recalled intense but erratic bursts. Kingsley radioed calmly, flak heavy on the right, adjusting line. But these transmissions would be among the last anyone heard from either aircraft. Moments later, the B-25s began their final attack run. Pilots in trailing positions reported seeing Kingsley's bomber descending slightly, likely to acquire the target, while Hale maintained position off his wing. Then, in the chaos of bombing, strafing, and abrupt evasive turns, the two aircraft simply disappeared. No one saw them peel off. No one watched them fall. A rear formation pilot later testified that one moment both planes were visible through the smoke, and the next moment the clouds had enveloped the entire area. What happened inside that moving, shifting haze remains uncertain. As one crew member recalled, it was like the island swallowed them whole. Back at Guadalcanal, when the formation returned 2 aircraft short, commanders immediately initiated a search. Dozens of B-25s and PBY Catalina flying boats fanned out across Bougainville's western waters throughout the afternoon. Pilots scanned for oil slicks, rafts, burned foliage, anything that might indicate a crash site. The search was hampered by the same storm systems that had cloaked the attack area earlier that morning. Heavy rain reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. Even the Catalinas, famous for their ability to linger, struggled to maintain visual coverage. The squadron intelligence report from that day is stark. No confirmed sighting of aircraft. No smoke columns. Possible inland crash. Terrain makes confirmation unlikely. Bougainville's interior was an almost impenetrable wilderness, steep ridges, volcanic foothills, and jungle so thick that downed aircraft could remain concealed for decades. Several post-war expeditions attempted to locate Kingsley and Hale, driven partly by accounts from local residents who claimed to have heard a large machine overhead around the time of the disappearance. But these accounts contradicted each other. Some placed the sound near the inland mountains, others near the coast, and none led to a verifiable wreck. Historically, B-25s could be torn apart by direct flak hits, but even catastrophic explosions generally left a debris field identifiable from the air. The absence of such evidence added a shadow of mystery to the event. Did both aircraft collide inside the cloud? Did a sudden weather shear force them off course and into the high ridges? Or did one crash and the other circle to help, losing its bearings and fuel over the jungle? Squadron diaries note these possibilities but conclude hauntingly, outcome unknown. Last contact during attack run. In recent decades, military historians and aviation archaeologists have returned to Bougainville with improved mapping tools and local cooperation. Several wrecks from other lost aircraft have been found, but none matching the serial numbers or camouflage patterns of Kingsley's or Hale's B-25s. Their disappearance remains one of the more perplexing losses of the Bougainville campaign, not because of enemy action, but because the conditions at the moment of vanishing leave so many plausible yet unprovable explanations. The mystery deepens when considered in the context of other disappearances across the Pacific. The environment itself, vast seas, island jungles, sudden storms, could hide evidence indefinitely. And yet, in this case, two aircraft vanished simultaneously without a single witness to their fate. It was a chilling reminder that even experienced crews flying well-maintained aircraft could disappear in seconds. As May turned to June, the squadron returned to its missions, but Kingsley and Hale were never far from their thoughts. For the families waiting back home, telegrams would soon arrive bearing the familiar, agonizing phrasing, "Missing in action, circumstances unknown." And their case would not be the last. Just months later, another Allied pilot disappeared over New Guinea, this time on a routine ferry flight, under conditions just as confounding. By late 1943, the Allied air campaign in New Guinea had matured into one of the most logistically complex operations of the Pacific War. Airfields carved from jungle mud became gateways to the front, and pilots routinely ferried aircraft between bases perched along the Owen Stanley Range. These missions were considered routine compared to combat sorties, but the word routine was dangerously deceptive. The mountains could generate storms within minutes, radios often suffered interference, and even experienced pilots could lose their bearings in a landscape where clouds clung to the terrain like smoke. It was under these conditions that Flight Officer Tom Mercer of the Royal Australian Air Force vanished during a simple ferry flight, one that should have taken less than 2 hours. Mercer was no novice. Trained under the RAF's Coastal Command program before transferring to the RAF, he had gained a reputation for precision flying and calm judgment under pressure. His assignment in November 1943 was straightforward: ferry a Curtiss P-40N Warhawk from Port Moresby to Nadzab. The aircraft had been serviced, refueled, and cleared for transfer. No bombs, no ammunition, just a clean fighter and a pilot familiar with the route. His squadron diary noted, "Weather unsettled in the range, but nothing out of the ordinary for New Guinea's spring storms." Most pilots flew the corridor weekly. At 0940 hours, Mercer lifted off from Port Moresby's Ward Strip. Witnesses watched the P-40 climb smoothly before banking toward the northeast. His early radio check-in was routine, climbing through 5,000. Visibility fair. Proceeding as planned. For the next 20 minutes, he followed the long-established path that skirted the southern foothills of the Owen Stanley Range. Other ferry pilots that morning reported scattered showers and cloud buildup along Kokoda Gap, but no major turbulence. Nothing suggested that Mercer's flight would become one of the most enduring disappearances of the New Guinea War. Around 1020 hours, Mercer made his second scheduled radio call. His transmission was clear but brief, cloud thickening, adjusting course westward. Then silence. Several attempts to raise him yielded no response. At first, controllers assumed temporary interference. The mountains frequently disrupted radio waves, and pilots sometimes dipped below line of sight to avoid cloud banks. But when Mercer failed to arrive at Nadzab by 11:20, his expected landing time, alarms spread quickly. Nadzab Tower contacted Moresby. Moresby confirmed Mercer had not returned. A search was ordered before noon. To understand the difficulty of that search, one must picture New Guinea's terrain during the war. Dense rainforest cloaked steep mountain slopes. Ridgelines plunged into ravines so deep they remained in perpetual shadow. A downed aircraft could disappear beneath canopy without leaving a visible scar. And with the Japanese still active along parts of the range, search planes risked interception. Even so, RAF Beauforts and USAF A-20 swept the likely flight corridors throughout the afternoon. They saw nothing. Reports from villages along the Kokoda track added a tantalizing layer of uncertainty. Several communities claimed to have heard an aircraft overhead late that morning. Some described it as low or struggling. Others said it sounded as if circling. But the accounts varied widely in timing and direction. Without radar records or visual confirmation, investigators were left piecing together ambiguous testimony in terrain that could easily distort sound. One clue considered at the time was sudden weather formation. Meteorological logs indicate that a fast-moving storm cell developed over the central range just after 1,000 hours, with vertical winds strong enough to push aircraft off course. Pilots later recalled that cell as one of the harshest of the month. Rain so heavy it sounded like gravel against the canopy, downdrafts capable of yanking small fighters thousands of feet downward. If Mercer flew into that storm while attempting to adjust his course, He may have been forced blind into the mountains. Still, no wreckage was ever located. Post-war aerial surveys uncovered dozens of P-40 crash sites across New Guinea, burned-out engines, scattered wings, rusted machine gun mounts. But none matched Mercer's serial number or markings. In 1951, an Australian patrol investigated a potential site reported by villagers, but found only fragments from a Japanese Ki-43. Another lead in the 1970s suggested a P-40 buried beneath a landslide, but the terrain prevented excavation. Mercer's disappearance also raised questions among his peers. A fellow pilot wrote in his journal, "Tom was steady. If any man could put a bird down in the jungle and walk out, it was him." That remark fueled speculation that Mercer may have attempted an emergency landing and survived the initial crash. Some theorize he could have been injured, lost, or trapped in inaccessible terrain. Others point out that dense canopy could easily obscure a crashed Warhawk for decades. Even today, hikers in the region occasionally stumble upon forgotten aircraft scattered in ravines. Modern historians examining the case note the convergence of small factors: deteriorating visibility, unpredictable storm development, limited radio contact, and the unforgiving geography of the Owen Stanley Range. Any one of these issues could jeopardize a flight. Together, they formed a perfect trap for an aircraft flying alone. What remains most haunting is the ordinariness of Mercer's mission. No enemy fighters. No heavy flak. No combat stress. Just a ferry flight, one flown hundreds of times during the New Guinea campaign. His disappearance underscored that even outside active combat zones, the Pacific War carried dangers every bit as lethal as enemy bullets. And while Mercer's fate remained unknown, another case, only months later, would strike even deeper into the heart of Allied operations, as a veteran U.S. Navy fighter pilot vanished during one of the largest carrier battles of the entire war. In June 1944, the Pacific War reached a decisive crescendo as the United States launched the massive offensive to seize the Mariana Islands. This campaign triggered one of the largest naval air engagements in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was a battle defined by scale, hundreds of aircraft clashing across thousands of square miles of ocean. Yet within that vast spectacle, individual stories of courage, chaos, and loss played out in ways that were often overshadowed. Among them was the mysterious disappearance of Lieutenant James Warren of VF-11, a seasoned fighter pilot whose experience should have made him one of the most survivable men in the sky. Warren flew the Grumman F-6F Hellcat from the USS Hornet, one of the carriers forming the backbone of Task Force 58. By this stage in the war, the Hellcat dominated the skies with its rugged design and powerful Pratt & Whitney engine. Warren himself had already earned a reputation during raids over the Marshalls as a composed, analytical pilot. His squadron logbook described him as reliable, disciplined, and unshakable, the kind of aviator who could fly into the most intense dogfight and come out steady enough to critique his own maneuvers afterward. That reputation made his disappearance all the more baffling. On June 19, the battle erupted as Japanese carrier groups launched wave after wave of aircraft in an attempt to halt the American advance. The ensuing action became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a testament to the lopsided losses inflicted on the Japanese flyers. VF-11 scrambled repeatedly throughout the day, intercepting enemy formations at extreme range. Warren flew in the second major sortie, tasked with reaching a distant vector where radar had detected incoming bogies. Shortly after takeoff, Warren formed up with his division and climbed toward the intercept point. The first minutes went exactly as expected. A long ascent, coordinated radio chatter, and constant updates from fighter direction officers aboard the Hornet. Then, as the division engaged scattered groups of Japanese aircraft, the formation began to loosen. The fighting quickly fragmented into dozens of individual duels across a broad swath of sky. Warren's wingman, Ensign Patrick Lewis, reported that during one of these engagements Warren broke formation in pursuit of a retreating enemy fighter. The maneuver wasn't unusual. Pilots often chased stragglers to prevent them from regrouping. But Lewis noted something odd. Warren's turn was sharper than necessary, and he appeared to lose altitude rapidly. At first Lewis assumed Warren had spotted another threat. Then his silhouette drifted farther away, swallowed by the shifting cloud layers forming over the ocean below. Lewis attempted radio contact. Blue 2, this is Blue Lead, status? No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Minutes later, when the dogfight dissolved and the Hellcats began forming up for the return flight, Warren did not reappear. One possibility weighed heavily on the squadron: fuel. The Hellcat maintained excellent range, but the distances involved in this sortie pushed pilots to the margin. A prolonged chase or a misjudged throttle setting could leave a pilot short on fuel for the return to the carrier. If Warren had lost visual reference, become disoriented, or drifted farther from the task force, he might have realized too late that he could not make it back. Task Force 58 initiated an immediate search. Dozens of fighter pilots returning from the battle scanned the water during their recovery approach. Later, dedicated search planes, mostly Avengers and Catalinas, conducted grid searches into the evening. Conditions were favorable at first, but as night approached, the ocean darkened and the horizon dissolved into haze. The carriers eventually had to cease search operations to recover their aircraft, a decision no commander ever made lightly. The next morning, the search widened. Crewmen trained their binoculars across empty swells, looking for any sign of a life raft, a dye marker, or the distinctive orange flare that pilots were instructed to ignite after ditching. Nothing was found. The sea offered no clues. Post-battle analysis left investigators with few certainties. There was no radio distress call, no confirmed sighting of Warren's Hellcat going down, no enemy claim matching his disappearance. One hypothesis suggested he may have descended too low while following the fleeing enemy aircraft, perhaps losing energy in a steep bank and entering an unrecoverable dive. Another posited fuel starvation. If Warren had miscalculated consumption or taken longer than expected chasing his target, he might have been forced to ditch far outside the search zone. Lewis, his wingman, struggled with the memory for decades. In a post-war interview he said, "Jim wasn't reckless. If he chased someone he had a reason. But the weather, the distance, they could trick even the best." His words reflect the grim reality of air combat over the open Pacific. Even highly skilled pilots could disappear in seconds, the ocean absorbing aircraft with unsettling speed. Modern historians examining the battle note that dozens of aircraft from both sides were lost that day, many without witnesses. The scale of the engagement, combined with the vastness of the ocean, created conditions ripe for unexplained vanishings. Still, Warren's case persists as one of the more puzzling. An experienced pilot flying a reliable aircraft in broad daylight, gone without a trace. As the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended in overwhelming American victory, the disappearance of pilots like Warren served as a sobering counterbalance to the triumph. Behind every statistic was a life, a cockpit, a call sign that would never answer again. And yet, even as Warren's fate remained unresolved, the Pacific War held one final mystery, an early war disappearance that would later connect, thematically, with all the others and highlight a disturbing pattern across the entire theater. As 1945 approached, the Pacific theater shifted into its final and most ferocious phase. American forces were tightening the noose around Japan, and the skies from the Philippines to Iwo Jima swarmed with aircraft on bombing raids, escort missions, and long-distance reconnaissance flights. Yet even with improved technology, better navigation, and hard-won pilot experience, the sheer vastness of the Pacific continued to claim aircraft in ways that defied explanation. One such loss was that of Ensign Richard Colton of the U.S. Navy, a pilot whose disappearance during a routine weather reconnaissance flight exposed the enduring vulnerabilities of even the most modernized Allied operations. Colton flew the Grumman F-6 F-5 Hellcat from the escort carrier USS Catochin Bay, part of the amphibious support group operating near Leyte in late 1944. While he lacked the combat experience of frontline aces, he possessed an outstanding flight record and a reputation for meticulous procedure. He treated every flight like a checklist carved in stone, one crew chief recalled. During the Philippines campaign, escort carriers like his launched countless routine sorties, weather scouts, anti-submarine patrols, and long sweeps ahead of convoys to detect enemy aircraft before they could strike. Most of these flights were workmanlike, uneventful, and rarely mentioned in official histories. But on November 27, Colton's mission would be anything but routine. Shortly after dawn, Colton was assigned a solo weather reconnaissance sortie to survey cloud conditions north of the convoy. His task was simple: climb to 10,000 feet, report visibility, wind direction, and potential storm development. These observations were crucial for the carrier's flight operations that morning. Colton lifted off smoothly, his Hellcat climbing into the golden haze rising off the water. Visibility good, ceiling stable, he radioed at 0632 hours. It was his last confirmed transmission. What happened over the next 20 minutes remains uncertain. The carrier group expected Colton to continue his pattern, reporting conditions every 10 minutes. When no update came at 0642, the operations officer attempted to reach him. The silence was met with mild concern. Radios occasionally cut out, and pilots sometimes waited until completing a turn before transmitting. But by 0650, with still no response, concern hardened into alarm. Radar operators aboard the Catochin Bay scanned their screens for Colton's return track. But echo returns over ocean waves were notoriously unreliable. At 0700, a second sweep confirmed what the officers feared: no sign of his Hellcat. Weather conditions remained stable. There were no storm cells, no sudden cloud banks forming, and no reported enemy aircraft. If Colton had suffered mechanical trouble, he was expected to radio at least a brief distress call, standard Navy protocol drilled into every fighter pilot. Yet nothing came. A full search began immediately. Escort carriers and destroyers launched additional aircraft to comb the area in widening arcs. Pilots were instructed to watch for life rafts, oil slicks, or flare smoke. 4 hours, the Pacific lay calm, waves rolling in long, unbroken lines. It was ideal search weather, the kind every rescue team hoped for. If there was wreckage floating, they would have seen it. But they saw nothing. Investigators later reconstructed possible scenarios based on his last transmission. The first and most likely was mechanical failure. Hellcats were rugged aircraft, but engine seizures were not unheard of, especially after prolonged periods of carrier operations where maintenance crews were stretched thin. A sudden engine failure at altitude could have forced Colton to ditch. But even a clean ditching typically left debris, especially from a fighter as large as the F-6F. No debris was found. The second scenario involved spatial disorientation, a known hazard during solo flights over water, particularly shortly after sunrise. Pilots sometimes misjudged horizon contrast, entering slow, unrecognized descents. But Colton was experienced and had flown dawn patrols before. And if he'd lost his bearings, his natural instinct would be to call for vectors back to the ship. Again, silence. A third possibility surfaced in squadron discussions: fuel contamination. In late 1944, several escort carriers reported isolated incidents of water entering aviation fuel lines due to rapid condensation. If Colton's engine had sputtered or failed unexpectedly, he might have attempted an emergency ditching before he could transmit. But the Catochin Bay's fuel logs from that morning show no anomalies. Throughout the afternoon, search crews expanded their grid to nearly 300 square miles. They dropped dye markers and smoke floats to measure drift patterns. Conditions ideal. Search area fully covered, the after-action report later stated. Yet nothing, no wreckage, no raft, no flare, ever materialized. The mystery deepened as days passed. Japanese air activity that morning had been negligible. No enemy pilot claimed a kill consistent with a lone Hellcat. Submarine reports in the region showed no contacts. And Colton, by all accounts, was as disciplined a pilot as the Navy could ask for. The Pacific, however, had swallowed him whole. In the end, the Navy declared him missing, presumed lost. His disappearance reminded commanders that even with superior air power and modern aircraft, the Pacific remained a vast and indifferent frontier. Colton's loss, though overshadowed by larger battles, echoed the same haunting pattern that had marked earlier vanishings across the theater. Experienced pilots, stable conditions, and no trace left behind. And as investigators pieced together the final unresolved cases of the war, they began to notice just how frequently these unexplained disappearances had occurred across the Pacific, leading to a concluding pattern that would emerge only after the war ended. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the Pacific was littered with the wreckage of thousands of aircraft, crashed, submerged, or hidden beneath jungle canopy. Yet for all the debris the war left behind, a surprising number of Allied pilots simply vanished, leaving no crash site, no final radio call, and no conclusive explanation. As military archivists and investigators began compiling post-war air loss summaries, a troubling pattern emerged. Certain disappearances, scattered across years, units, nations, and mission types, defied the usual markers of combat loss. Among these were the 5 cases explored in this series. Different men, different aircraft, different circumstances, yet linked by the same haunting absence of answers. The U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the Royal Australian Air Force all conducted extensive post-war investigations to clarify their missing airmen lists. Search teams revisited crash zones, interviewed local populations, cross-referenced Japanese records, and reviewed aerial photographs taken throughout the campaigns. In most cases, wrecks were eventually identified, and the fates of missing pilots could be reconstructed with reasonable certainty. But for a subset of air crews, men like Ensign Harold Dixon near Rabaul, Lieutenants Kingsley and Hale over Bougainville, Flight Officer Mercer in the Owen Stanley Range, Lieutenant James Warren in the Philippine Sea, and Ensign Colton near Leyte, no answers emerged. What puzzled investigators most was that these disappearances spanned the war's timeline. Dixon vanished in early 1942, when the Allies were still reeling from Japan's advance. Kingsley and Hale disappeared in 1943, amid dangerous but improving operational conditions. Mercer vanished the same year on a simple ferry flight. Warren disappeared in 1944, during one of the best documented battles of the entire war. Colton vanished later that year despite excellent weather and advanced carrier operations. These weren't clustered anomalies, they were individual events that occurred under unrelated circumstances. Yet each shared a common thread. No wreckage was located then and none has been located since. Post-war intelligence officers proposed several broad categories of explanation. Some were practical: rapid sinking in deep water, destruction upon impact, navigational disorientation, or weather-driven course deviation. Others focused on search gaps, moments when conditions or distance temporarily outran Allied search capabilities. But none of these explanations perfectly fit all the cases. Take Dixon's disappearance. Calm seas, clear weather, and proximity to friendly search planes should have increased the chances of recovery. Yet no floating debris was ever confirmed. For Kingsley and Hale, the chaotic combination of cloud, flak, and jungle offered plausible camouflage for a crash site, but the simultaneous disappearance of both aircraft under nearly identical circumstances remained unusual. Mercer's loss could be attributed to storm development, but no trace surfaced despite multiple local reports and decades of ground surveys. Warren disappeared in broad daylight near one of the largest naval forces ever assembled. And Colton vanished in ideal conditions during a mission monitored by radar and carrier operations teams. None of the disappearances pointed to a single cause, but collectively, they underscored the extreme limitations Allied forces faced in a theater measured in millions of square miles. One naval historian wrote, "The Pacific was not merely a battlefield, it was an absorber of evidence." This sentiment is echoed across contemporary academic reassessments. The Pacific's deep trenches, fast currents, violent monsoons, and impenetrable rainforests combined to create an environment where even large aircraft could vanish without a trace. A Hellcat or AB-25, powerful and heavy, could sink within minutes in water thousands of feet deep. A-40 striking a steep ridge could shatter into pieces that became indistinguishable from the surrounding trees. A life raft could drift dozens of miles overnight before deflating, leaving no clue behind. Yet statistics alone cannot fully explain what families, squadrons, and historians felt when these stories were re-examined decades later. It wasn't merely the physical disappearance that haunted them, it was the silence surrounding the final moments. No distress calls. No sightings. No reports from enemy forces. Just absence. Squadron diaries reflect this emotional weight. One note from late 1944 reads, "We lose men in battle, but we understand battle. What we cannot understand are the ones who simply do not return." In many ways, these disappearances became symbolic of the Pacific War's broader nature. A conflict defined not only by combat, but by distance, uncertainty, and terrain that challenged even the most skilled aviators. Modern expeditions, led by archaeologists, documentary teams, and volunteer organizations, continue to search the jungles and ocean floors of the Pacific. Advances in sonar, LiDAR mapping, and satellite imaging have allowed researchers to locate dozens of previously unknown wrecks. But for every discovery made, many more remain hidden. As of today, the 5 men whose stories anchor this narrative remain among the thousands still listed as missing in action. Their disappearances form a somber epilogue to the Pacific Air War. A reminder that even with courage, skill, and advanced machinery, the natural world of the Pacific had the final say. And in that immense frontier, some stories end not with violent confirmation, but with quiet, enduring mystery, left open not by imagination, but by the war's own vast and unforgiving geography.